Imagine waking up to find a massive semi-truck deliberately blocking your driveway, with an HOA you never joined, demanding thousands in backdated dues. What happened next would spark a neighborhood war that nobody expected. But they picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. Subscribe to hear more incredible true stories of standing up against injustice. Don't forget to hit that notification bell to never miss an upload. Emma Richardson never considered herself a fighter. As a successful architectural designer working from her cherished home office, she had spent the last 5 years building her reputation for creating sustainable, modern home designs that perfectly balanced form and function. Her colonial-style house, perched on a quiet street in the suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, was both her sanctuary and her inspiration. The property, with its thoughtfully landscaped yard and converted garage-turned-design studio, stood out from the cookie-cutter homes that dominated the newer developments surrounding her neighborhood. Emma had deliberately chosen this location when she purchased the house in 2019, specifically because it wasn't part of any homeowners association. She dealt with enough rigid guidelines and restrictions in her professional life. Her home needed to be a place where creativity could flourish without constraint. "Your house has character," her clients would often say during consultations in her studio, admiring the way she'd transformed the space into a showcase of innovative design elements. The large windows she'd installed captured natural light perfectly, while the vertical garden along the exterior wall demonstrated her commitment to incorporating sustainable features into traditional spaces. Emma's decision to avoid HOA-controlled neighborhoods hadn't been random. During her years designing homes for clients, she'd witnessed countless horror stories of homeowners battling arbitrary rules and excessive fines. "I'll never understand why people willingly sign away their property rights," she would tell her sister Jessica during their weekly coffee dates. "The horror stories I hear from my clients about their HOAs are enough to make anyone think twice." Her section of Pine Grove Road represented one of the last remaining pockets of independence in the rapidly developing area. While newer subdivisions sprouted up around them with their matching mailboxes and strictly regulated paint colors, Emma's street maintained its diverse character. Her next-door neighbor, Mr. Chen, took pride in his traditional Chinese garden, while across the street, the Hendersons' Victorian-style home bore witness to 3 generations of family history. That independence had served them well. When Emma decided to paint her front door a bold cobalt blue or install solar panels on her roof, she didn't need to submit forms in triplicate or await approval from a committee. Her designs, both personal and professional, were limited only by her imagination and local building codes. The spring of 2025 had started particularly well for Emma. Her design firm had just landed a major contract to create plans for an eco-friendly housing development in a neighboring county. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd be designing homes that would ultimately be controlled by an HOA, but at least she could ensure they were built with character and sustainability in mind. "You're making waves in the industry," her friend and real estate agent Marcus had told her over lunch last week. "People are starting to notice that sustainable design doesn't have to mean sacrificing style or breaking the bank." Emma had smiled at that, knowing her growing success was built on exactly that principle. Her morning routine rarely varied. She would wake up early, enjoy her coffee on the back deck overlooking her herb garden, and then head to her studio to work on designs. The converted garage, with its exposed brick walls and polished concrete floors, had become something of a local landmark. Young architects and designers would occasionally stop by, hoping to gain insight into her sustainable design approaches. But on this particular Wednesday morning in April, as Emma sipped her coffee and reviewed emails on her tablet, she had no idea that her peaceful world was about to be shattered. No idea that her commitment to independence was about to be tested in ways she never imagined. No idea that her quiet street was about to become the battleground for a conflict that would expose the darker side of suburban development and community. Control. She had noticed small changes in the neighborhood recently. Surveyors taking measurements near the street corners, unexpected visits from city officials photographing properties, whispered conversations between neighbors that would stop when she approached. But Emma had brushed these off as routine development activities in a growing area. After all, her property deed was clear. She owned her land outright, free from any HOA entanglements. "You might want to keep an eye on things," Mr. Chen had warned her last weekend as she helped him unload groceries from his car. "I've been hearing rumors about changes coming to the neighborhood." Emma had thanked him for his concern, but wasn't worried. Her property rights were secure, her business was thriving, and she had good relationships with her neighbors. What could possibly go wrong? The answer to that question would arrive with the morning sun, announced by the diesel rumble of a massive engine and the screech of air brakes. The sound that would mark the beginning of a battle Emma never wanted, but was about to prove she was more than ready to fight. As she stepped out of her shower and began preparing for what she thought would be another productive day in her studio, Emma had no way of knowing that her next design project would be one of survival, protecting not just her property rights, but the very essence of what made their small pocket of independence special. The security cameras she'd installed last year for her home office requirements quietly recorded as a shadow fell across her driveway. The first act in a drama that would transform not just Emma's life but the entire neighborhood was about to begin. And it would start with the illegal parking of a semi-truck that would become the catalyst for a war nobody saw coming. Like this video if you want to hear more stories about standing up to HOAs, and don't forget to subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you've ever dealt with an unreasonable HOA. Now let's get back to how Emma's peaceful morning was about to turn into a suburban nightmare. The first indication that something was wrong came from the aggressive rumble of a diesel engine, far too close to Emma's house. She was halfway through responding to an important client email when the noise cut through her concentration. The sound was followed by the distinctive hiss of air brakes, a sound that had no business being anywhere near her residential driveway. Emma's fingers froze over her keyboard as her home office suddenly darkened, an enormous shadow falling across her windows. Setting down her coffee mug, she pushed back from her desk and moved to the window, her heart beginning to race as the situation came into focus. There, blocking her entire driveway and part of the street, sat a massive white Peterbilt semi-truck. Its chrome finish gleamed aggressively in the morning sun, and its size made her colonial home look almost diminutive in comparison. But what really caught her attention was the banner stretched across its side, its message written in bold red letters that seemed to shout from the fabric, "Pay your HOA dues or lose access to your property." "What in the world?" Emma muttered, quickly slipping on her shoes. As she rushed to her front door, her phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Chen. "Emma, are you seeing this? Do you need help?" The spring air felt charged with tension as Emma stepped outside. The truck's engine was still running, its idle rumble creating an ominous soundtrack to the surreal scene. A small crowd of neighbors had already gathered at the edges of their properties, watching with mixed expressions of concern and curiosity. A man in a neon yellow safety vest leaned against the truck's cab, scrolling through his phone with exaggerated nonchalance. He looked up as Emma approached, revealing a face weathered by years on the road and a smirk that immediately set her teeth on edge. "Something I can help you with?" Emma called out, working to keep her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "You're blocking my driveway." The driver, his vest identified him as Mike, straightened up and pocketed his phone. "Sure is," he replied, his tone casual as if they were discussing the weather. Got orders to park here until you settle up your dues. 3 years of back payments plus penalties. Comes to about 15 grand by my paperwork. Emma felt her professional composure slipping. What dues? What HOA? I'm not part of any homeowners association. Never have been. Move your truck or I'm calling the police. Mike pulled a wrinkled pack of cigarettes from his pocket, tapping one out with practiced ease. Look, lady, I just drive where they tell. Me. But I got official papers right here saying you owe Pine Grove Estates HOA for dues dating back to 2022. He lit his cigarette, the smoke drifting lazily in the morning air. You can call whoever you want, but this rig ain't moving until you pay up. Emma pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the police non-emergency number. As she waited on hold, she noticed Jessica's car pulling up to the curb. Her sister must have seen her earlier text about the situation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Jessica, a paralegal at one of Charlotte's top law firms, quickly assessed the scene as she approached. What's going on? Who authorized this? She demanded, her legal training evident in her rapid-fire questions. Before Emma could respond, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up behind the Semi. The man who stepped out looked like he'd just walked off a corporate recruiting poster. Perfectly pressed suit, expertly styled hair, and a smile that probably cost more than Emma's monthly mortgage payment. "Miss Richardson," he called out, approaching with his hand extended. "I'm Bradley Thompson, representing Pine Grove Estates Community Association. I see you've received our message about your outstanding dues." Emma ignored his outstretched hand. "There must be some mistake. My property isn't part of any HOA. I have the deed and all supporting documentation to prove it." Bradley's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Actually, Ms. Richardson, your property falls within our recently expanded jurisdiction. The City Council approved our petition to incorporate previously unaffiliated properties into our association 3 months ago. Notices were sent out to all affected homeowners." "That's impossible," Jessica interjected, her legal training evident in her tone. "HOAs can't just forcibly incorporate existing properties without owner consent. Where's your documentation?" Bradley reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Everything's in order, I assure you. Your sister's property, along with several others in this area, now falls under our governance. The dues are non-negotiable, and quite frankly, they're long overdue." Emma finally got through to the police dispatcher and quickly explained the situation. As she spoke, she noticed more neighbors gathering, including Mr. Chen, who was recording everything on his phone. Bradley's smile tightened as he noticed the growing audience. "Ms. Richardson, this could all be resolved quickly if you'd simply bring your property into compliance and pay the outstanding balance. We're even willing to set up a payment plan." "I never agreed to join your HOA," Emma stated firmly, ending her call with the dispatcher. "You can't retroactively charge me for membership in an organization I never joined. The police are on their way." Bradley's pleasant demeanor slipped slightly. "The police won't help you, Ms. Richardson. This is a civil matter. That truck will remain where it is until you comply with the association's requirements. And let me be clear, the longer this takes, the more expenses you'll incur." Emma felt her professional calm evaporating. She dealt with difficult clients and challenging city planners, but this was different. This was a direct threat to everything she'd built. "My next call will be to my lawyer," she warned, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Bradley spread his hands in a gesture of false concern. "By all means, involve your attorneys, but remember, legal battles are expensive, and the association has very deep pockets. Why put yourself through all that stress when you could simply comply?" Jessica stepped forward, her paralegal training evident in her stance. "Are you threatening my sister?" "Not at all. Bradley replied smoothly. "Just stating facts. The association has a legal right to enforce its regulations, and we will use every tool at our disposal to ensure compliance." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. 2 police cruisers pulled up, their lights flashing. As the officers approached, Emma noticed Bradley's confident smile return. The lead officer, a sergeant based on his uniform, took in the scene with practiced neutrality. What seems to be the problem here? Before Emma could speak, Bradley stepped forward with another manila envelope. "No problem, officer. Just a routine enforcement action regarding unpaid HOA dues. We have all the necessary documentation right here." The sergeant reviewed the papers, while Emma and Jessica tried to explain the situation. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up with an apologetic expression. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but this appears to be a civil matter. We can't force them to move the truck unless it's creating a public hazard or violating traffic laws. You'll need to resolve this through proper legal channels." Emma felt her stomach drop as Bradley's smirk widened. The truck's diesel engine continued its menacing rumble, a constant reminder of the battle that had just begun. "This isn't over," she told Bradley, her voice low and determined. "You're right about that, Ms. Richardson," he replied, straightening his tie. "It's only just beginning. I suggest you think carefully about your next move." As the police departed and Bradley returned to his Mercedes, Emma stood in her blocked driveway, her mind racing. She had clients expecting meetings, deadlines to meet, and now this absurd situation to deal with. Jessica squeezed her arm supportively. "Don't worry, I'm calling the firm right now. We'll fight this." Emma nodded, watching as Mr. Chen and other neighbors approached to offer their support. This wasn't just about a blocked driveway anymore. This was about standing up to bullies who thought they could strong-arm their way into controlling their lives. Looking at the massive truck casting its shadow over her property, Emma made a decision. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. But first, she had a tow truck to call. Want to know what happens next? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to catch part 3 of this wild HOA showdown. As the morning sun climbed higher in the Charlotte sky, Emma Richardson sat at her kitchen table, her untouched coffee growing cold as she scrolled through local towing company listings on her phone. Jessica sat across from her, already deep in conversation with a colleague at her law firm. "Listen, David, I know it's short notice, but we need advice now," Jessica was saying, her free hand taking rapid notes. "They're claiming the city council approved some kind of forced HOA incorporation." "Yes, exactly. No prior consent, no notification received." Emma found a promising listing. Big Jim's Towing and Recovery, no job too big. Their website specifically mentioned experience with commercial vehicles. Perfect. She dialed the number, her heart pounding as it rang. "Big Jim's," a gruff voice answered. "Hi, I need a semi-truck towed from my private property immediately. It's been parked here without permission, blocking my driveway completely." There was a pause on the other end. "A semi? That's a specialty job, ma'am. Got proper authorization for the removal?" Emma's grip tightened on her phone. "It's on my private property, blocking access to my home and business. I never authorized it to be there." "All right," the voice replied, sounding more interested. "But fair warning, this kind of job ain't cheap. We're talking premium rates, especially if there's any pushback from the truck owner." "I don't care about the cost," Emma replied firmly. "How quickly can you get here?" As she gave her address, she noticed Mr. Chen approaching her front door through the kitchen window. She quickly wrapped up the call. The tow truck would arrive within the hour and went to let him in. "Emma," he said immediately, holding up his tablet, "you need to see this. I've been doing some research since they showed up this morning." He pulled up a local government website pointing to a notice buried deep in the public records section. "Look at the date on this rezoning proposal." Emma leaned in, scanning the document. The proposal, filed 3 months ago, outlined plans for community standardization and property value protection measures in their neighborhood. It was written in dense legal language that seemed deliberately obscure. They tried to hide this, Mr. Chen continued, his voice tight with anger. No direct notifications, no public hearings. They buried it in bureaucratic paperwork, hoping nobody would notice until it was too late. Jessica ended her call and joined them, examining the document. This is interesting, she said, her legal training evident in her focused expression. The language is carefully worded to avoid explicitly mentioning HOA expansion. They're using terms like community integration and unified development standards. Instead, can they do that? Emma asked, just as another vehicle pulled up outside. A police car, but different from the ones that had responded earlier. Through the window, they watched as a plainclothes detective stepped out, followed by a uniformed officer. Emma opened the door before they could knock. "Ms. Richardson?" the detective asked, showing her badge. "I'm Detective Sarah Martinez. We received some concerning reports about a situation here this morning." Emma quickly explained the situation, showing them the Semi still idling in her driveway and Bradley Thompson's questionable documentation. Detective Martinez frowned as she reviewed the papers. "This is troubling," she admitted. "The documentation they provided to our patrol officers earlier was incomplete. There are some irregularities here that warrant further investigation." Hope fluttered in Emma's chest, but the detective's next words dampened it. "However," Martinez continued, "while we look into the potentially fraudulent aspects, we still can't forcibly remove the vehicle. It remains a civil matter unless we can prove criminal intent." "So they can just block my property indefinitely?" Emma demanded. "Not indefinitely," the detective replied, "but the legal process needs to be followed. Have you contacted a lawyer?" "My sister's firm is already working on it," Emma said, gesturing to Jessica. "And I've called a towing company." Martinez's eyebrows rose. "Be careful with that approach. If they've filed any kind of lien or claim on the property, removing the truck could expose you to liability." "What am I supposed to do then?" Emma asked, frustration evident in her voice. "I have clients coming, deadlines to meet. I run my business from home." Before the detective could respond, 2 more vehicles appeared. Bradley Thompson's Mercedes had returned, accompanied by a white SUV with Pine Grove Estate Security emblazoned on its side. "Wonderful," Emma muttered as Bradley approached, his expensive shoes clicking on her walkway. "Ms. Richardson," he called out, his tone unnecessarily loud, "I've been informed you're attempting to arrange unauthorized removal of association property. I strongly advise against such action." Detective Martinez turned to face him. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to ask you some questions about the documentation you provided earlier." Bradley's smile didn't waver, but Emma noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. "Of course, Detective. Though I'll need to consult with our legal team before discussing any specific details. We want to ensure everything is handled properly." The detective pulled out her notebook. "Let's start with the basics. Can you explain why the HOA expansion documentation wasn't properly filed with the county clerk's office?" For the first time, Bradley's composed facade cracked slightly. I'm not familiar with the specific filing procedures. Our legal team handles those details." "Convenient," Jessica muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The tension was interrupted by the distinctive sound of a heavy-duty tow truck approaching. Big Jim's towing had arrived, and the truck that pulled up was massive, clearly equipped to handle a semi. A burly man in a grease-stained coverall stepped out, assessing the situation with practiced eyes. "Who called for a tow?" "I did," Emma said, stepping forward. "And I have all my property documentation right here." She held up a folder containing her deed and property surveys. Bradley quickly moved to intercept the tow truck operator. This vehicle is legally parked pursuant to a property lien. Removal would constitute theft of association property. The operator looked between them, clearly trying to decide who to believe. Detective Martinez stepped in. "Sir, no valid lien has been filed with the county. However, I should inform you that if there's any dispute over the vehicle's removal, you could potentially be drawn into civil litigation." The tow operator scratched his head. "Lady, if you own the property and want this rig moved, I can move it. But with all these complications, the rate's going to be double, and you'll need to sign a waiver taking full responsibility for any legal issues." Emma didn't hesitate. "Where do I sign?" Bradley's phone was already at his ear. "This is Thompson. Get our lawyers down here immediately and bring the documentation for the injunction." But Emma had stopped listening. She was watching the tow operator begin his work, methodically preparing the semi for removal. Bradley's voice rose in volume as he argued with someone on the phone, while Detective Martinez continued taking notes and asking pointed questions about the HOA's documentation. Mr. Chen had his tablet out again, recording everything. Other neighbors had gathered at the edges of their properties, watching the scene unfold. Emma noticed several of them giving her encouraging nods. The process of preparing the semi for towing was complex and time-consuming. The truck driver, Mike, had disappeared earlier, leaving the engine running, a detail that Detective Martinez noted with interest. As the tow operator worked, Bradley paced, making call after call. The HOA security vehicle's lights flashed uselessly, its uniformed officer standing by, looking unsure of his role in the situation. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the tow operator gave Emma a thumbs up. The semi was secured and ready for removal. Bradley made one last attempt to stop it. "Ms. Richardson," he called out, his composure finally cracking. "This action will have serious consequences. The association will be forced to take severe measures." "Are you threatening me again, Mr. Thompson?" Emma asked loudly, making sure Detective Martinez could hear. "Please, be specific about these severe measures you're planning." Bradley's mouth snapped shut as the detective turned to look at him with renewed interest. The tow truck's engine roared to life, and slowly, inexorably, the semi that had been blocking Emma's driveway began to move. The sound of its air brakes releasing was like music to her ears. As the trucks pulled away, Bradley stormed back to his Mercedes, already barking orders into his phone. Detective Martinez handed Emma her card. "Call me directly if they try anything else," she said quietly, "and document everything." Emma nodded, watching as the various vehicles departed, leaving her driveway blessedly empty. But she knew this wasn't over. Bradley's threats of severe measures hung in the air like storm clouds on the horizon. Jessica squeezed her arm. "You did the right thing. Now let's get ready for their next move." Emma looked at her now clear driveway, then at the supportive faces of her neighbors. She'd won this round, but something told her the real battle was just beginning. Emma's victory with the towed semi-truck proved to be short-lived. The next morning, she woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly with text messages from neighbors. As she grabbed her phone, still groggy from a restless night's sleep, her heart sank at the messages flooding her screen. "Emma, look, outside now. They've gone too far this time. Can't believe what they've done to your driveway." Throwing on her robe, Emma rushed to her front window. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. Where her pristine driveway had been just hours before now, sat an enormous pile of construction debris. Broken concrete slabs, twisted metal rebar, splintered wooden pallets, and what appeared to be demolished drywall created a small mountain that completely blocked access to both her home and design studio. "Oh my God," she whispered quickly, dialing Jessica's number as she rushed outside for a closer look. The morning sun revealed the full extent of the vandalism. The debris pile wasn't just randomly dumped. It had been carefully arranged to create maximum obstruction. Pieces of concrete had been positioned to make removal as difficult as possible, while sharp metal pieces jutted out at dangerous angles. Jessica answered on the second ring. "I'm already on my way," she said before Emma could speak. "Don't touch anything. We need to document everything." As Emma circled the debris pile, she noticed something that made her stomach turn. Mixed in with the construction waste were splintered pieces of what appeared to be expensive hardwood, the same material she used in her custom furniture designs. With growing horror, she realized these weren't random pieces. They were the remains of a custom dining table she'd been creating for an important client, clearly stolen from her workshop overnight. Detective Martinez arrived just as Emma finished her initial survey of the damage. The detective's expression darkened as she took in the scene. "This is different," Martinez said, pulling out her camera. "This crosses a line into criminal vandalism and theft. You're sure that table was in your workshop last night?" Emma nodded, fighting back tears of rage. It was a commissioned piece worth thousands. The client was supposed to pick it up next week. Mr. Chen appeared with his tablet, already documenting everything from multiple angles. "I installed a security camera after yesterday's incident," he said grimly. "It caught something interesting around 3 a.m. They huddled around his tablet, watching grainy nighttime footage. Two figures in dark clothing could be seen directing a dump truck as it deposited the debris. The quality wasn't good enough to identify faces, but one of the figures moved with a distinctive swagger that Emma recognized immediately. It was Mike, the semi-truck driver from yesterday. "Notice the truck," Detective Martinez said, pointing to the footage. "No license plate visible, but there's a company logo on the door. Thompson Construction Services." Emma's eyes widened. "Thompson? Like Bradley Thompson?" The detective nodded grimly. "Could be a coincidence, but..." She was interrupted by the arrival of Bradley himself, stepping out of his Mercedes with an expression of exaggerated concern. "Ms. Richardson," he called out, approaching the debris pile. "What happened here? This is exactly the kind of neighborhood issue our association works to prevent. If you had proper security measures in place, the kind our HOA requires, this sort of thing might have been avoided." Emma felt her professional composure slipping. "Are you seriously trying to blame this on me? After your threats yesterday about severe measures?" Bradley's smile didn't waver. "Threats? I don't recall making any threats. I simply warned you about the natural consequences of refusing to comply with community standards. Speaking of which..." He pulled out his phone, appearing to take photos of the debris. "This kind of mess violates at least 6 different association bylaws. We'll have to issue citations." "Citations?" Emma sputtered. "You dump garbage on my property and then try to fine me for it?" Now, Bradley replied smoothly. "You have no proof who deposited this debris. But as a property owner, you're responsible for maintaining your lot in accordance with community standards. I'm afraid these violations will need to be addressed immediately." Detective Martinez stepped forward, badge visible. "Mr. Thompson, interesting coincidence about the truck that dumped this debris. Any connection to Thompson Construction Services?" For the first time, Bradley's composure cracked slightly. "Wouldn't know anything about that. Thompson is a common name. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other properties to inspect." As Bradley retreated to his car, Emma noticed Jessica had arrived and was already on her phone, taking photos and making calls. The next hour was a blur of activity. Police photographers documenting the scene, Emma filing reports about her stolen furniture, and neighbors stopping by to offer support. By mid-morning, Emma had contacted the same towing company about removing the debris, but this time they were hesitant. "Ma'am, this is different from towing a vehicle," the dispatcher explained. "With construction debris, we need permits and proper disposal documentation. If any of it is contaminated or contains hazardous materials, we could be liable." Emma's frustration mounted as she called company after company, each giving similar responses. The debris pile sat mockingly in her driveway, a monument to the HOA's intimidation tactics. Around noon, another unwelcome visitor arrived. A man in a city inspector's uniform approached, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Richardson, we've received complaints about unauthorized construction waste disposal at this address. I'll need to conduct an inspection and issue any necessary citations." Emma fought to keep her voice steady. "This was dumped here illegally overnight. I'm the victim here." The inspector's expression remained neutral. "Nevertheless, the property owner is responsible for compliance with city waste management regulations. Until this is properly cleared through authorized channels, I'll have to issue daily fines." As if on cue, Bradley's Mercedes cruised past, moving slowly enough for Emma to see his smug smile through the tinted windows. Jessica pulled Emma aside as the inspector began his assessment. "They're trying to drown you in bureaucracy," she said quietly. "The HOA files complaints with the city, which forces inspections and fines, which they'll then use as evidence that you're not maintaining your property to their standards. It's a deliberate strategy." Emma watched as the inspector methodically photographed and documented the debris pile. "So what do we do?" "We fight back smart," Jessica replied. "I've been doing some digging into Thompson Construction Services. There are some interesting connections we can use, and that security footage from Mr. Chen, we can enhance it. Plus, I've got a contact at the local news station who might be very interested in this story." The inspector finished his work, handing Emma a preliminary citation with a hefty fine attached. As he left, Emma noticed more neighbors gathering, including elderly Mrs. Peterson from 3 doors down. "Emma dear," Mrs. Peterson called out, moving surprisingly quickly for someone in her 80s. "You need to see this. I was going through my late husband's files. He was on the City Planning Commission before he passed. Look what I found." She handed over a folder containing what appeared to be old zoning documents and meeting minutes. Emma's eyes widened as she scanned the contents. "This is about Thompson Construction Services," she said. "From 5 years ago, they were denied permits for a major development project in this area because they were caught trying to bribe commission members," Mrs. Peterson finished, "including offers of HOA board positions in their proposed development. Bradley's father was the company president back then." A plan began forming in Emma's mind. The HOA thought they could bury her in bureaucracy and intimidation. Fine, she had documentation, witnesses, security footage, and now evidence of a pattern of corruption. It was time to stop playing defense. Looking at the debris pile that had been meant to break her spirit, Emma felt a new sense of determination. They hadn't just picked a fight with a homeowner, they'd picked a fight with an entire community, and that community was starting to fight back. While Emma waited for her lawyer to review Mrs. Peterson's documents, she decided to do some investigating of her own. The debris pile still dominated her driveway, but it had become more than just an obstacle. It was now a symbol of the HOA's increasingly suspicious behavior. That evening, after most of her neighbors had returned to their homes, Emma sat at her kitchen table with Jessica and Mr. Chen, spreading out various documents, including Mrs. Peterson's folder. The setting sun cast long shadows through her windows as they began connecting the dots. "Look at this," Jessica said, pointing to a highlighted section in an old city council meeting transcript. Thompson Construction Services tried to push through a massive development project here 5 years ago. They wanted to build a luxury shopping center with high-end condos. Mr. Chen leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. But they were denied because of the bribery scandal. Bradley's father, Richard Thompson, lost his contractor's license over it. And now they're back, Emma mused. But this time, they're using the HOA as their weapon instead of direct bribes. Their research session was interrupted by an unexpected knock at the door. Emma approached cautiously, checking through the peephole. To her surprise, she saw Mike, the truck driver from yesterday, shifting nervously on her porch. "Should I let him in?" Emma whispered to Jessica, who was already recording with her phone. "Do it," Jessica nodded. "But keep the chain on." Emma opened the door partially. Mike looked different now, his earlier swagger replaced by obvious discomfort. "Ms. Richardson," he said, glancing over his shoulder, "we need to talk, but not here. They might be watching." After a tense discussion through the crack in the door, they agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown in 30 minutes. Emma was suspicious, but something in Mike's demeanor seemed genuine. "This could be a trap," Jessica warned as they drove downtown. "They might be trying to set you up somehow." "That's why you're coming with me," Emma replied, "and why Mr. Chen is parked across the street with his camera ready." The coffee shop was nearly empty when they arrived. Mike sat in a corner booth, nursing a cup of black coffee, his usual cigarette nowhere in sight. He'd traded his safety vest for a worn denim jacket that made him look smaller somehow, more human. "I'm not proud of what I did," he began as soon as they sat down, his voice low. "But I got kids to feed, and Thompson, Bradley, he knows things about my past that could cost me my commercial license." Over the next hour, Mike painted a picture that was even darker than Emma had imagined. The HOA expansion was just the tip of the iceberg. Thompson Construction Services, now run by Bradley after his father's disgrace, had been quietly buying up properties throughout the area through shell companies. "They need your street," Mike explained, "especially your property. It's the missing piece in their development puzzle. The shopping center plan never died, they just changed tactics. Now they're using the HOA to force people out instead of trying to buy them out directly." "But they can't just force properties into an HOA," Jessica interjected. "It's not legal." Mike smiled grimly. "Tell that to the city council members, who've been quietly appointed to positions in Thompson's other developments. They've got people in their pocket all over local government." As Mike continued talking, Emma's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Martinez. "Found something interesting about Thompson Construction. Need to meet ASAP." They arranged to meet the detective at the police station after finishing with Mike, who provided one final piece of information before leaving. "Check the debris in your driveway carefully," he said cryptically. "They didn't just dump it randomly. Look for anything that seems electronic." At the police station, Detective Martinez led them to a small conference room. The wall was covered in photos and documents connected by red strings, a pattern that made Emma's heart race. "Thompson Construction Services isn't just one company," Martinez explained, pointing to a complex web of business registrations. "It's the public face of a network of LLCs and shell corporations. They've been buying up properties through different entities, making it hard to trace the pattern." "But why go through all this trouble?" Emma asked. "Why not just try to buy people out legitimately?" The detective pulled up a map on her computer. "Because this isn't just about a shopping center anymore. Look at where your street sits in relation to the city's planned infrastructure projects." The map revealed that Emma's neighborhood sat at a crucial junction between several major development zones. Whoever controlled that area would essentially control access to millions of dollars in potential development opportunities. The HOA takeover attempt isn't just about forcing out homeowners, Martinez continued. It's about controlling the entire area's development future. And your property, Ms. Richardson, sits right at the heart of it. Emma thought back to Mike's cryptic warning about the debris. Detective, could they have hidden something in that pile? Something electronic? Martinez's expression sharpened. Like surveillance equipment, it would fit their pattern. They've been caught using illegal monitoring devices in other developments. They rushed back to Emma's house, where Mr. Chen was already examining the debris pile with a flashlight. As they approached, he waved them over excitedly. "Look at this," he said, pointing to what appeared to be thin wires running beneath the concrete chunks. "These aren't from construction debris. They're data cables." Detective Martinez pulled out her phone, quickly photographing the discovery. "They're not just trying to block your driveway," she said grimly. "They're using the debris as cover to install surveillance equipment on your property." Emma felt a chill despite the warm evening air. "They're spying on me." "More than that," Jessica added, her legal mind racing. "They're trying to establish some kind of presence on your property. If they can prove they've had equipment here for a certain period, they might try to claim some sort of easement or right of access," Martinez finished. "It's a long shot legally, but with their connections in the city government." Emma stared at the debris pile, seeing it with new eyes. What she'd thought was just intimidation was actually part of a much larger, more calculated plan. The HOA wasn't just trying to force her out. They were laying groundwork for a legal takeover of her property. As they documented the surveillance equipment, Emma's phone buzzed with another text, this time from an unknown number. "Back off now, or the next delivery won't be just debris." Emma showed the message to Detective Martinez, who immediately began procedures to trace it. But Emma hardly needed to guess its origin. The stakes had just been raised significantly. "They're getting desperate," Jessica observed, watching her sister's face. "This kind of explicit threat means we're getting close to something they really don't want us to find." Emma nodded, her initial fear giving way to determination. "Then we keep digging. The deeper this goes, the more evidence we have against them." As night fell, Emma stood in her driveway, looking at the pile of debris that had seemed like such a simple act of revenge just that morning. Now she understood it was much more, a piece in a larger puzzle of corruption and greed that stretched from her quiet street all the way to the city council chambers. The question was no longer just about standing up to an aggressive HOA. It was about exposing a conspiracy that threatened not just her property, but the entire community's future. The next morning, Emma's kitchen had transformed into a makeshift war room. Coffee cups cluttered the table as she, Jessica, Detective Martinez, and Mr. Chen gathered around Mrs. Peterson's old documents and the detective's case files. The morning sun cast long shadows across stacks of papers, property records, and printed screenshots of threatening text messages. "Let's lay out everything we know," Jessica said, taping a large piece of paper to Emma's pristine white wall. She began creating a timeline, starting with Thompson Construction's failed development project 5 years ago. Detective Martinez added her own notes. "Here's where it gets interesting," she said, pointing to a cluster of dates. "After the bribery scandal, the Thompsons didn't just give up. They started creating shell companies. Look at these registration dates." Emma leaned in, studying the documents. All these companies were formed within weeks of each other, right after Bradley Thompson took over from his father. "Exactly," Martinez continued, "and each one started buying properties in different parts of the neighborhood. Small parcels at first, nothing suspicious on its own, but when you map it all together..." Mr. Chen pulled up a digital map on his tablet, overlaying property ownership data. The pattern was striking. A patchwork of seemingly unrelated properties that, when viewed together, formed a clear strategic pattern around Emma's street. "They're creating a net," Emma realized. "My property isn't just valuable on its own, it's the key to connecting all their other holdings." Their planning session was interrupted by a knock at the door. Through the window, they saw Mrs. Peterson, clutching another folder and looking agitated. "You need to see this," she said as soon as Emma let her in. "I was up all night going through Henry's old files. Look what I found about the water rights." The new documents revealed another layer to the conspiracy. The area's water management system, installed decades ago, ran primarily through easements on private properties, including a major junction point under Emma's land. "That's why they're so desperate to control this property," Jessica exclaimed. "It's not just about the development potential. Whoever controls these water rights essentially controls development possibilities for the entire district." Detective Martinez was already making calls. "This changes things. Water rights manipulation crosses into federal jurisdiction. I need to contact some colleagues." Emma's phone buzzed, a text from Mike. "Meeting happening tonight. Country Club, Thompson and the others. 8 p.m. "We need evidence," Martinez said after Emma showed her the message. "Photos, recordings, anything that proves they're conspiring to illegally seize properties. I might be able to help with that," Mr. Chen said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "I used to work in corporate security before retiring. I still have some equipment that could be useful." The next few hours were a flurry of activity. Jessica worked with her law firm to prepare emergency injunctions based on the water rights discovery. Detective Martinez coordinated with federal authorities. Mr. Chen disappeared briefly, returning with a collection of sophisticated surveillance equipment. "These are completely legal to own," he assured them, setting up what looked like an ordinary pen on Emma's table, just not always legal to use without consent. Emma raised an eyebrow. "Is this going to get us in trouble?" "Less trouble than they're in if we can prove conspiracy," Martinez replied, examining the pen with professional interest. "Just don't try to admit any of this in court." By late afternoon, they had a plan. Mike had provided Emma with a legitimate invitation to the country club. Apparently, Thompson was maintaining appearances by hosting a community meeting about property improvements. Emma would attend openly, wearing Mr. Chen's specially equipped pen. "Remember," Jessica coached her sister, "you're not there to confront them. Just observe and record. Let them talk. People like Bradley love to brag when they think they're winning." Emma nodded, trying to calm her nerves as she changed into a business suit. The navy blue outfit was one she usually reserved for client meetings, but tonight it would serve as camouflage. "One more thing," Martinez added, handing Emma a small device. "This is an official police wire, completely admissible in court, unlike our friend's spy pen. Keep it in your purse as backup." As Emma prepared to leave, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Bradley Thompson himself. "Looking forward to seeing you tonight, Ms. Richardson. Perhaps we can discuss a reasonable resolution to our situation." "They're getting cocky," Jessica observed, reading over Emma's shoulder. "That's good. Overconfident people make mistakes." Emma arrived at the country club precisely at 8 p.m., pulling her car into a spot with a clear view of both the main entrance and the service door Mike had told them about. The building's colonial architecture loomed against the darkening sky, its windows glowing warmly. Inside, she was greeted by Bradley's practiced smile. "Ms. Richardson, so glad you could join us. Perhaps this indicates a willingness to be more uncooperative?" Emma forced herself to smile back. "Let's just say I'm interested in learning more about the association's plans for our community." Bradley led her into a wood-paneled conference room where about a dozen people sat around a massive mahogany table. Emma recognized several faces from Bradley's previous visits, plus a few she knew were city council members. "Everyone, Ms. Richardson has graciously joined us tonight," Bradley announced. "I trust we can speak freely among friends." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in casual corruption, As drinks flowed and guards dropped, the conversation shifted from vague pleasantries about community improvements to explicitly detailed plans for forcing out problematic property owners. Bradley, clearly enjoying himself, laid out their strategy with remarkable candor. "The beauty of the HOA approach," he explained, "is that it's all technically legal. Once we establish jurisdiction, we can make life so difficult that selling becomes the only option. And guess who's there to buy at rock-bottom prices?" Emma fought to keep her expression neutral as Bradley continued, detailing how they'd manipulated city council votes, planted false stories about property violations, and used shell companies to hide their true intentions. "Your property, Ms. Richardson," he said, turning to her with another practiced smile, "is particularly crucial to our plans. Those water rights running through your land, worth more than the property itself. So what do you say? Ready to discuss a reasonable offer?" "I'll need time to consider my options," Emma replied carefully, her heart pounding as she realized just how much incriminating evidence they'd collected. As she left the meeting, she noticed Bradley watching her thoughtfully. Had she been too quiet, too cooperative? Her hands shook slightly as she drove home, both recording devices safely secured. Back at her house, the team quickly gathered to review the evidence. The recordings were damning. Explicit discussions of illegal property manipulation, admissions of document forgery, even casual mentions of bribing city officials. "This is exactly what we needed," Martinez said, already making copies of the files. "Between this and the water rights documentation, we can shut them down completely." "Don't celebrate yet," Jessica cautioned. "People like this don't go down easily. They'll fight back hard when they realize what we have." As if on cue, Emma's phone lit up with another text from Bradley. "You really should have taken the offer. Remember what I said about severe measures? Time to find out what that means." Emma showed the message to the others. Mr. Chen immediately began checking his security cameras, while Martinez called for a patrol car to monitor the street. "We need to move fast," Jessica said, gathering the documents. "First thing tomorrow, we file everything we have with the court. Once it's in the public record, they can't make it disappear." Emma nodded, but something about Bradley's threat nagged at her. He had seemed too confident at the meeting, too willing to speak openly about their plans. Had they walked into a trap? Looking out her window at the quiet street, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. They had their evidence, but at what cost? Emma woke the next morning to an eerie silence. The usual sounds of early traffic and birdsong were strangely absent. As she made her way to her kitchen, the first rays of sunlight filtering through, her windows revealed why. Her entire property had been surrounded by tall construction barriers overnight, the kind used for major demolition projects. Her phone was already buzzing with messages. The first was from Mr. Chen. They came at 4 a.m., multiple trucks, professional crew, all wearing Thompson construction vests. The second was from Detective Martinez. "Don't leave your house. On my way with backup." The third made her blood run cold. Bradley Thompson. "Last chance, Ms. Richardson. Accidents happen on construction sites all the time. Wouldn't want any debris to accidentally fall on your precious design studio." Emma rushed to her front door, her hands trembling as she turned the lock. The sight that greeted her was like something from a nightmare. The orange construction barriers formed a complete perimeter around her property, towering at least 12 feet high. Posted every few feet were official-looking notices declaring the area an active construction zone, no unauthorized entry. "Ah, they've trapped me in," she whispered to herself, just as Jessica's car screeched to a halt at the barrier's edge. "Emma!" her sister called out, trying to find a way through. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but I'm completely boxed in." A Thompson construction truck pulled up, and two burly workers began unloading additional barriers, effectively blocking Jessica's car. "Ma'am, "You'll need to move your vehicle," one worker said. "This is an active construction zone." "Active construction zone?" Jessica shot back. "This is private property. You have no permits for this." "Actually," Bradley's smooth voice cut in as his Mercedes pulled up, "we have all the necessary documentation right here." He held up a stack of official-looking papers. "Emergency demolition order from the city. Seems there are serious structural concerns about Ms. Richardson's property. As the local HOA, we have a responsibility to ensure public safety." Detective Martinez arrived just then, lights flashing. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, approaching with her badge visible. "This looks an awful lot like false imprisonment." "Not at all, Detective," Bradley replied, his smile never wavering. "Ms. Richardson is free to leave at any time. We're simply securing a dangerous construction site. If you'll examine these permits." He handed over a thick folder of documents. Martinez flipped through them, her frown deepening. "These were filed last night and approved this morning," she said. "Emergency action due to..." She paused, reading, "potential sinkhole development and water main instability." "Precisely," Bradley nodded. "Given the water lines running under the property, we had no choice but to act quickly. Public safety, you understand?" Emma felt her stomach drop. They were using the very water rights information she'd discovered against her. "This is ridiculous," Jessica interjected. "These permits were clearly pushed through without proper review. We'll have them invalidated by noon." "Perhaps," Bradley conceded, "but until then, this is officially a construction zone. And speaking of construction..." He nodded to his workers, who started up a jackhammer just feet from Emma's design studio. The vibrations shook the building immediately. Emma watched in horror as her expensive drafting equipment rattled on its stands. "Stop this!" she shouted over the noise. "You're going to damage my equipment." "Can't hear you over the..." "Essential safety work," Bradley called back, making a show of putting on protective ear gear. Detective Martinez was already on her phone, presumably calling for backup. Jessica had her laptop out, frantically drafting emergency motions. But the jackhammer continued its assault, joined now by the beeping of heavy equipment backing up. To the barriers, Emma rushed back inside to rescue her most valuable equipment, carefully packing away precise instruments and delicate design materials. As she worked, her phone buzzed with a text from Mike. "Check your security cameras from 3:45 a.m. You need to see who signed the permits." She pulled up the footage on her tablet, zooming in on the pre-dawn activity. There, clearly visible, was a city inspector, the same one who had cited her for the debris pile, accepting what appeared to be an envelope from Bradley before signing documents on the hood of his car. "Detective," Emma called out, running the footage to her front door and holding it up. "We've got proof of bribery." Martinez examined the video carefully. "This helps, but those permits are still technically valid until a judge says otherwise. Best I can do right now is document any property damage they cause." The jackhammer stopped abruptly, replaced by an even more ominous sound, the creaking of heavy machinery. Emma looked up to see a massive crane being positioned over her property. "Ms. Richardson!" Bradley called out through a bullhorn. "As your property has been deemed structurally unsound, we'll need to begin emergency demolition procedures immediately. I suggest you vacate the premises. Or..." His voice took on a silky quality. "We could discuss a more amicable resolution. My offer from last night still stands." Emma felt rage building in her chest. They were literally trying to demolish her out of her own home. Just then, a new vehicle pushed through the growing crowd of onlookers, a TV news van. "Right on time," Jessica smiled grimly. "I called in a favor. Let's see how Bradley handles his corruption being broadcast live." The news crew quickly set up, their cameras focusing on the bizarre scene. Bradley's smug expression faltered slightly. As the reporter approached him, microphone extended. Mr. Thompson, can you explain why your company is attempting to demolish a private residence without the owner's consent? We have sources suggesting these permits were obtained through questionable means. Bradley backed away from the camera, suddenly less interested in using his bullhorn. The crane operator, apparently not wanting to be filmed, powered down his equipment. Emma seized the moment, addressing the cameras herself. They're trying to force me out because my property is key to their illegal development scheme. We have evidence of corruption, bribery, and illegal surveillance. She held up her tablet, showing the pre-dawn footage. The reporter's eyes lit up at the mention of surveillance. Would you care to elaborate on that? For the next 20 minutes, Emma laid out the entire story: the initial truck blockade, the debris dump, the discoveries about water rights, and the previous night's recorded admissions. The cameras caught it all, including Bradley's increasingly panicked expression as she spoke. His phone seemed to be buzzing constantly now, and Emma could guess why. His investors and conspirators, watching their scheme unravel on live television. But Bradley wasn't finished. He pulled out his own phone, making a show of dialing. "Yes, send them in now," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Moments later, 3 police cars arrived, but not Detective Martinez's colleagues. These officers emerged with military precision, wearing tactical gear. "What's this?" Martinez demanded, approaching the ranking officer. "Private security detail," the officer replied. "Contracted by the city for construction site protection. We have orders to clear all unauthorized personnel from the area." "This is still an active police investigation," Martinez protested. But the security team was already moving to establish a perimeter, pushing back the news crew and witnesses. Emma found herself being herded back into her house by the security team, while Jessica and Martinez were forced beyond the barriers. The news crew continued filming from their new position, capturing the increasingly militarized scene. "Don't worry," Jessica called out. "We'll have an emergency injunction within the hour. Just stay inside and document everything." As Emma watched her allies being pushed back, she noticed something odd. Bradley was having an intense argument with someone on his phone, his face reddening with each passing moment. Finally, he exploded. "What do you mean, shut it down? We're too close. I don't care about optics. We need to. Hello? Hello?" The live news coverage had done its job. Bradley's investors were clearly getting nervous about the public exposure. But Emma knew better than to celebrate too early. Bradley's face had shifted from angry to calculated. He might be losing support, but that only made him more dangerous. "Pack up," he barked at his workers, "but leave the barriers. Ms. Richardson can enjoy her cage while we reassess the situation." As the construction equipment withdrew, leaving only the barriers and private security, Emma received one final text from Bradley. "You think going public protects you? All you've done is guarantee that when I take you down, no one will see it coming." The construction barriers remained, firmly in place as night fell, casting long shadows across Emma's property. The private security team maintained their positions, their presence a clear message that Bradley wasn't backing down despite the media exposure. But Emma wasn't sitting idle. Her kitchen had become command central once again, though this time she was connecting with her allies through video calls rather than in person. Her laptop screen was split between multiple windows. Jessica coordinating with her law firm, Detective Martinez updating her on the investigation, and Mr. Chen monitoring the security team's movements through his cameras. "The emergency injunction is ready," Jessica announced, holding up a thick document to her camera. "We'll file it first thing in the morning when the courts open, but there's something else you need to see." She shared her screen, showing a series of emails that had been forwarded to her by an anonymous source. The correspondence was between Bradley and various city officials, dating back months. "Look at the timing," Jessica pointed out. "They've been planning this lockdown since before the truck incident. The construction barriers, the private security, it was all staged." They were just waiting for an excuse. Detective Martinez's window lit up as she joined the conversation. That tracks with what we've found. Those security officers, they're not just random rent-a-cops. They're from a private military contractor that Thompson Construction has used before in other disputed developments. Emma watched through. Her window, as one of the security officers, made another pass around the barriers. His movements indeed more professional than typical security guards. But here's what really interests me, Martinez continued, sharing her own screen. I did some digging into similar cases across the state. This isn't the first time Thompson Construction has used these tactics. Look at these reports from other communities. The documents revealed a pattern. Properties declared unsafe, emergency permits pushed through overnight, sudden construction barriers appearing, all targeting holdouts who refused to sell to Thompson's various shell companies. What happened to those other homeowners? Emma asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Most of them sold, Martinez replied grimly. The ones who didn't. Let's just say they experienced unfortunate accidents during the construction work. A notification popped up on Emma's screen, a new email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Former Thompson target can help." After Martinez verified the email's legitimacy, Emma opened it. The message was from a woman named Sarah Kelly, a former homeowner from a neighborhood that Thompson had successfully taken over 2 years ago. "I lost everything fighting them," Sarah wrote, "but I kept records of everything they did. Names, dates, bank transfers, things I was too scared to reveal back then. If you're really going to take them down, I want to help." Emma quickly added Sarah to their video call. The woman who appeared on screen looked worn but determined, clutching a manila envelope. "There were others like me," Sarah explained. "We all tried to fight them individually and we all lost. But you've done something we never managed. You've got them on camera, in the media. You've made it public." She held up her envelope. These documents show how they laundered money through fake construction contracts, how they bribed inspectors, how they fabricated safety violations. I've been keeping them as insurance, but now they're evidence, Martinez finished, already making arrangements to collect Sarah's documents. As they talked, Emma's phone began buzzing with text messages from her neighbors. Word had spread about the video call, and others wanted to join. Soon, her screen was filled with familiar faces from her street, each with their own story to tell. Mr. Peterson had overheard conversations between Bradley and city officials at the golf club. The Hendersons had photographs of late-night meetings between Thompson construction vehicles and city inspectors. Even Mrs. Chen, who rarely got involved in neighborhood issues, had saved emails from Thompson trying to pressure her into selling. "This is exactly what we need," Jessica said excitedly. "A pattern of behavior, multiple witnesses, documented evidence of corruption. They thought isolating you would weaken you, but they've actually helped create a stronger coalition." Emma felt a surge of hope as she watched her neighbors sharing information, coordinating their evidence. The barriers outside might have physically isolated her, but they'd inadvertently created something powerful, a united community ready to fight back. "We need to move fast," Martinez warned. "Bradley's not going to sit back while we build our case. Those barriers aren't just for show. They're preparing for something." As if on cue, Emma heard engines starting up outside. Through her window, she saw several large trucks pulling up, their Thompson Construction logos partially covered with black tape. "They're bringing in more equipment," Mr. Chen reported through the call, his cameras tracking the activity. "But something's odd about these trucks. They're not carrying construction gear." Emma squinted at her dark window, trying to make out what was being unloaded. The security teams had positioned themselves to block most of the view, but she caught glimpses of what looked like electronic equipment being set up around the barriers. "Some kind of surveillance setup," Martinez observed. They're creating a monitoring perimeter, probably planning to record anyone who tries to help you, gather dirt on your allies. Two can play at that game, Mr. Chen replied. He held up what looked like a small drone. My cameras aren't the only technology I kept from my security days. Give me an hour, I'll have eyes on everything they're doing. As the group coordinated their counter-surveillance efforts, Emma received another text from Bradley. Making friends won't save you. Everyone has secrets, Ms. Richardson. How long will your allies stand with you once those secrets start coming out? Emma shared the message with the group. Instead of causing fear, it sparked determination. He thinks he can threaten us individually, Sarah spoke up. That's how they won before. But together, let them try to intimidate all of us. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. Jessica and her legal team began preparing individual affidavits for each neighbor's testimony. Martinez coordinated with her federal contacts, building a RICO case against Thompson Construction and its shell companies. Mr. Chen's drone provided detailed maps of the surveillance equipment being installed, while Sarah and other former Thompson victims shared their documentation. By midnight, what had started as a desperate video call had evolved into a coordinated resistance. Neighbors were copying and securing evidence, creating backup plans for communication in case Bradley tried. To cut off Emma's internet or phone service and organizing shifts to monitor the barrier perimeter. Remember, Jessica cautioned as the meeting wound down, Bradley's dangerous because he's desperate. The media exposure hurt him badly, but cornered animals fight the hardest. Everyone needs to be careful. Emma looked out at the barriers once more before closing her curtains. The security lights created harsh shadows, and she could see the red dots of active surveillance cameras now mounted along the perimeter. But beyond that, she knew her neighbors were watching too, a network of allies ready to stand together. Her phone buzzed one final time that night, not a threat from Bradley, but a message from Mrs. Peterson. Henry would be proud of us all. This is what community really means. Looking at her screen filled with the faces of her neighbors, Emma felt something shift inside her. Bradley thought the barriers would isolate and break her. Instead, they'd helped forge something he couldn't buy or bulldoze. True solidarity. Dawn broke over the construction barriers, revealing a transformed landscape. During the night, Bradley's teams had completed their surveillance setup, creating what looked like a high-tech prison around Emma's property. But they weren't the only ones who had been busy. From her home office window, Emma watched Mr. Chen's drone making another silent pass overhead, its sophisticated camera capturing every detail of Thompson's operation. Her laptop displayed multiple video feeds, some from her own security. Cameras, others from neighbors' homes, strategically positioned around the perimeter. They've installed 23 cameras total, Mr. Chen reported through their secure video chat, plus infrared sensors and what appears to be signal jamming equipment. They're preparing for a siege. Jessica's window popped up next to his. The emergency hearing is scheduled for 2 p.m. today. Judge Caroline Matthews. She's tough but fair, known for coming down hard on corporate corruption. Emma nodded, taking another sip of her rapidly cooling coffee. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night helping Detective Martinez and Sarah Kelly organize the mountain of evidence they'd collected. Here's how it breaks down, Martinez began, sharing her screen with the group. We have documented proof of fraudulent permit applications, bribes to city officials, illegal surveillance operations, construction code violations, falsified safety reports, money laundering through shell companies, conspiracy to commit property fraud. Plus, Sarah added, statements from 17 former victims of their tactics in other neighborhoods. 3 of them are willing to testify in person. Emma's phone buzzed. Another text from Bradley. Enjoying the view. Those cameras work both ways. Interesting visitors you had last night. Would be a shame if certain building code violations were reported. He's bluffing, Jessica said when Emma shared the message. We've been completely legal with all our counter-surveillance. But this shows he's worried. He wouldn't be making threats if he wasn't. A new voice joined their call. Laura Chen, Mr. Chen's daughter, and a local investigative journalist who had been quietly gathering background information for them. You need to see this, Laura said, sharing an article she had been working on. I've traced Thompson Construction's shell companies to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They're moving money around, preparing for something big. Emma scanned the document, her eyes widening. These numbers, they're planning. Something much bigger than just taking over our neighborhood, aren't they? Laura nodded grimly. Once they control the water rights and land access through your property, they have everything they need to start a massive development project. We're talking billions in potential contracts. Which explains why they're fighting so hard, Jessica added. This isn't just about one holdout homeowner anymore. You're the key to their entire operation. A notification popped up. Sarah had found something in her old records that matched Laura's financial investigation. Look at these permit applications from 2 years ago, Sarah said, holding up faded documents to her camera. They tried to start this project back then, but they couldn't get approval because they didn't control the water rights. That's when they started targeting properties like Emma's. Detective Martinez's window lit up. This is exactly what we need. It shows premeditation, a long-term conspiracy. Judge Matthews will... She was cut off by a loud crashing sound from outside. Emma rushed to her window. A Thompson construction truck had accidentally backed into one of her garden trellises, destroying years of careful landscaping. Oops, the driver called out with exaggerated concern. Guess you should have kept your property better maintained. Looks like a safety hazard to me. Emma felt her hands shake with rage as she documented the damage, but her voice was steady as she called out, "All caught on camera, including your deliberate swerve to hit it." The driver's smirk faltered as he noticed multiple camera lenses focused on him. Not just Thompson's surveillance, but several neighbors' cameras as well. Jessica was already adding the incident to their evidence file. Keep documenting everything, every piece of damage, every threat, every accident. It all builds our case. As the morning progressed, Thompson's tactics escalated. The security teams began stopping and questioning anyone who came near the barriers, taking photos and recording names. Unmarked vans with satellite dishes appeared, presumably trying to intercept communications. But the neighborhood was ready. They had established a secure mesh network for communications, running through multiple redundant systems. Every threatening action by Thompson's people was photographed, logged, and added to their growing evidence file. 2 hours until the hearing, Jessica announced around noon. Bradley just filed a last-minute motion to delay, claiming he needs time to gather additional safety evidence. Classic stalling tactic, Martinez commented. He's trying to wear us down. The longer those barriers stay up, the more pressure on Emma to give in. Emma was about to respond when her power suddenly cut out. Her screens went dark, and the comforting hum of her climate control system fell silent. Right on schedule, Mr. Chen said through Emma's phone, which still worked thanks to their backup systems. They're testing our contingencies. Good thing we prepared for this. Within minutes, a low hum filled the air as hidden generators kicked in, part of the neighborhood's secret preparations. Emma's systems came back online, revealing frustrated expressions on Thompson's security team as they realized their power. Play had failed. They'll try cutting communications next, Martinez predicted. Then water, then. Let them, Emma replied firmly. We've got backups for everything. More importantly, we've got proof of every dirty trick they're pulling. Jessica's window suddenly lit up with excitement. Breaking news! The judge just denied Bradley's motion for delay. The hearing is still on for 2 p.m. and... She paused, Reading quickly, she's demanding Bradley appear in person to explain these emergency permits. A flurry of activity erupted beyond the barriers. Bradley had arrived, and he looked furious as he huddled with his security team. Even from a distance, Emma could see him gesturing angrily at the cameras and generators. He's realizing he's lost control of the narrative, Sarah observed. That's when they're most dangerous. Trust me, he'll have one more trick planned before the hearing. Laura's voice cut in urgently. Movement at City Hall. My source just sent this. She shared a document showing a hastily called meeting of the building commission. They're trying to push through an emergency demolition order. They can't, Jessica started, but Laura cut her off. They're claiming imminent danger due to water main instability. If they get this approved before the hearing, they won't, Martinez said firmly, because in about 30 seconds, every major news outlet in the city is going to receive an anonymous tip about corruption in the building commission, complete with proof. Sure enough, they soon heard sirens approaching, but not construction vehicles. Police cars were pulling up to City Hall, their lights flashing. Bradley's face was clearly visible through Emma's cameras as he received the news. His perfect composure finally cracked as he threw his phone against one of the barriers. 1 hour until the hearing, Jessica announced. Everyone ready? Emma looked around her home office, now transformed into a command center in their fight against corruption. Multiple screens showed their assembled evidence, witness statements, financial records, and surveillance footage. More importantly, they showed the faces of her neighbors and allies, all united and ready. Ready, she confirmed, gathering the final documents they'd need for court. Let's end this. The courthouse steps were crowded with news crews and spectators as Emma arrived for the emergency hearing. Though the construction barriers still surrounded her home, Bradley's security team had been forced to let her leave for the court appearance. Jessica walked beside her, carrying a thick briefcase full of evidence, while Detective Martinez followed close behind. Remember, Jessica whispered as they approached the entrance. Let the evidence speak for itself. Bradley's going to try to provoke you, make you look unstable. Don't give him the satisfaction. Inside, courtroom 3B was already packed. Emma recognized neighbors, former Thompson victims, and even a few city council members who looked decidedly uncomfortable. Sarah Kelly sat in the front row, clutching her envelope of documents, while Mr. Chen positioned himself strategically with his tablet, ready to access their surveillance footage. Bradley Thompson sat at the defendant's table, surrounded by a team of expensive-looking lawyers. His usual smug smile was firmly in place, but Emma noticed his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Caroline Matthews entered. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, took one look at the construction site photos in front of her and frowned. "Before we begin," Judge Matthews said, "I want to address the rather unusual timing of these emergency permits. Mr. Thompson, perhaps you can explain why a routine property inspection suddenly became a critical safety issue at exactly 3:45 a.m. Bradley stood smoothly. "Your Honor, as the documentation shows, our inspectors discovered serious structural concerns that required immediate action, given the water main's location." "Yes, the water main," the judge interrupted. "The same water main that's been safely running under this property for 40 years. The one that mysteriously became unstable right after Ms. Richardson refused to sell her property." Bradley's smile flickered slightly. "Your Honor, if you'll examine the engineer's report." "Oh, I've examined it," Judge Matthews cut in. "I've also examined some rather interesting financial transactions between Thompson Construction and certain city officials. Detective Martinez, I believe you have something to add." Martinez stepped forward, presenting a new set of documents. "Your Honor, We have evidence that the engineer who signed that report received a wire transfer of $50,000 from one of Thompson Construction's shell companies 12 hours before the inspection. Bradley's lawyers immediately objected, but the judge waved them off. Save your objections, counselors. I'm more interested in Mr. Thompson's explanation for these surveillance devices his team installed around Ms. Richardson's property. Standard safety monitoring equipment, Bradley began, but was cut off by Mr. Chen standing up. Your Honor, he called out, I have technical specifications proving those devices are military-grade surveillance equipment capable of intercepting private communications. Their installation without permits violates multiple federal laws. The judge's expression darkened. Mr. Thompson, would you care to explain why you need military-grade surveillance for a routine construction project? Bradley tugged at his collar, his composure cracking. Your Honor, given the sensitive nature of the development plans... Ah, yes, the development plans, Judge Matthews nodded. Ms. Richardson's counsel, you have something to present regarding those plans? Jessica stood, sharing knowing looks with Laura Chen in the gallery. Yes, Your Honor, we have documentation showing that Thompson Construction, through various shell companies, has been orchestrating a systematic campaign to force out homeowners who refuse to sell. The surveillance, the false safety reports, the emergency permits, they're all part of a larger conspiracy. She presented a detailed timeline, including Sarah's documents and Laura's financial investigation. As each piece of evidence was revealed, Bradley's face grew increasingly pale. Furthermore, Jessica continued, we have video evidence of Mr. Thompson himself admitting to these tactics during a meeting at the country club just 2 nights ago. Bradley shot to his feet. That recording was obtained illegally. Actually, Detective Martinez interjected, Ms. Richardson was wearing an authorized police wire during that meeting. The recording is fully admissible. The courtroom fell. Silent as Emma's recording played, Bradley's voice filling the room. The beauty of the HOA approach is that it's all technically legal. Once we establish jurisdiction, we can make life so difficult that selling becomes the only option. Judge Matthews held up her hand, stopping the playback. I've heard enough. Mr. Thompson, do you realize the number of federal and state laws you've violated? Bradley's lawyers huddled around him, whispering urgently, but he pushed them away. His calm facade had completely crumbled. This is ridiculous, he exploded. Do you have any idea what's at stake here? The development contracts alone are worth billions. One stubborn homeowner can't be allowed to block progress. Progress? Emma stood, her voice steady. You call corruption and intimidation progress? You've terrorized homeowners, destroyed properties, and bribed officials, all to force people out of their homes for your profit. The judge banged her gavel as Bradley tried to respond. That's enough. Based on the evidence presented, I'm issuing an immediate injunction. All construction barriers are to be removed from Ms. Richardson's property within the hour. Furthermore, I'm freezing all assets belonging to Thompson Construction and its subsidiary companies pending a full investigation. Bradley slumped in, his chair as the judge continued, Detective Martinez, I believe your federal colleagues will be very interested in the evidence presented here today. Mr. Thompson, consider yourself lucky if civil penalties are the only consequences you face. As Bradley was led away by federal agents who had been waiting in the gallery, Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her. The nightmare of the past few days was finally ending. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around them, cameras flashing. Emma stood with her neighbors and allies as Jessica handled the press statements. This case represents more than just one homeowner's fight, Jessica announced. It exposed a pattern of corruption that has affected communities across the state. Today's ruling sends a clear message. No corporation, no matter how powerful, is above the law. Emma's phone buzzed with messages from neighbors back home. Bradley's security teams were already dismantling the barriers, their operation crumbling as quickly as their leader's facade had in court. "You did it," Sarah said, hugging Emma tightly. "You actually did what none of us could." "We did it," Emma corrected her, looking around at the group. "All of us together." That's what Bradley never understood. He thought he could isolate and intimidate us individually, but he only made us stronger as a community. As they drove back to her neighborhood, Emma saw the last of the construction barriers being loaded onto trucks. Her property was free again, but something had fundamentally changed. The bonds formed with her neighbors during their fight against Thompson Construction had transformed their street from a collection of individual homes into a true community. Mr. Chen was already organizing a neighborhood celebration, while Mrs. Peterson talked about forming a legitimate community association, one focused on protecting homeowners rather than controlling them. Looking at her now unobstructed driveway, Emma felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Bradley's severe measures had backfired spectacularly, revealing not just his corruption, but the power of a united community standing up for what's right. The days following the court hearing brought a whirlwind of changes to Emma's quiet street. As federal agents combed through Thompson Construction's records, the full scope of Bradley's corruption began to emerge. News vans remained a constant presence, but now they were reporting on a story of community triumph rather than corporate intimidation. Emma sat in her newly restored garden, sipping coffee and watching as workers carefully repaired her damaged trellis. The morning sun highlighted the last visible traces of where the construction barriers had stood. Faint marks that would soon fade like the memory of Bradley's threats. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking: Thompson Construction CEO and officials indicted on multiple federal charges. Jessica called moments later. "Have you seen the indictment list?" her sister asked excitedly. 47 counts, including racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Bradley's looking at serious time. "What about the city officials involved?" Emma asked, thinking of the inspector who had signed those fraudulent permits. 7 arrests. "So far," Jessica replied. 3 council members, 2 inspectors, and this is the big one, the deputy mayor. They're all turning on each other, trying to cut deals. The sound of car doors closing drew Emma's attention to the street. Detective Martinez was approaching, accompanied by 2 FBI agents. "Ms. Richardson," Martinez called out with a smile. "Mind if we come in? There are some developments you should know about." In Emma's kitchen, the agents spread out documents showing a complex web of corruption, far beyond what they'd initially suspected. Thompson Construction was just the tip of the iceberg, one agent explained. Bradley's operation connected to at least 6 other development companies using similar tactics across 3 states. "Your evidence helped us crack open a nationwide investigation," Martinez added. "Those water rights Bradley was so desperate to control. Turns out he had already sold access to a major developer, promising something he didn't own. When you refused to sell, he was facing breach of contract charges worth millions." Emma shook her head, still processing the scale of it all. No wonder he was willing to go to such extremes. "But here's the real kicker," the second agent said, sliding forward a photograph. It showed Bradley in what appeared to be a heated argument with an older man who looked strikingly familiar. "Recognize him?" Emma studied the photo. That's Bradley's father, Richard Thompson. But I thought he was out of the picture after the bribery scandal." "Officially, yes," Martinez nodded. "But our investigation shows he never really left. He was pulling strings behind the scenes, using Bradley as the public face, while he ran the real operation through offshore accounts." The revelation sent Emma's mind spinning back to every interaction with Bradley, seeing his actions in a new light. His desperate need to control her property, his escalating tactics. He hadn't just been protecting his own interests, but trying to prove himself to his father. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. It was Mr. Chen, looking uncharacteristically excited. "Emma, you need to see this," he said, holding up his tablet. "Remember those surveillance devices they installed? Well, they forgot to remove some of their data storage units when they left. My security background finally came in handy. I was able to recover some very interesting footage." The recovered videos showed Bradley having late-night meetings around the neighborhood, exchanging envelopes with officials, and most damningly, instructing his teams on how to sabotage properties while making it look like accidents. "This is excellent," one of the FBI agents said, immediately copying the files. "With this evidence, even their high-priced lawyers won't be able to plea bargain their way out." As the morning progressed, more neighbors stopped by, each bringing new pieces to the puzzle. Sarah arrived with additional documents she'd found, showing how Thompson's tactics had evolved over the years. The Hendersons had old photographs proving Bradley had been scouting the neighborhood long before making any official moves. Around noon, Laura Chen called with another update. "The story's gone national," she reported. "I'm getting calls from major networks wanting to cover the community's fight against corporate corruption, but there's more. Other neighborhoods are coming forward with similar stories. You've started a movement, Emma." Emma looked around her kitchen, now crowded with neighbors, law enforcement officials, and stacks of evidence documenting years of corruption. The very room where Bradley had thought to intimidate her had become the center of his undoing. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unexpected source. It was Mike, the truck driver who had first blocked her driveway. "Testimony all done," his text read. "Told them everything. Bradley kept files on all of us, used our pasts to force us to help him. Thanks for showing us we could fight back." Jessica arrived later that afternoon with more news from the courthouse. "Judge Matthews is expanding the investigation," she announced. "She's ordered a complete review of every development project Thompson Construction has been involved with for the past 10 years. "What about our neighborhood?" Mrs. Peterson asked. "All those properties they acquired through intimidation." "That's actually why I'm here," Jessica smiled. "The judge is appointing a special master to review each case. Any property obtained through their illegal tactics will be offered back to the original owners at their previous sale price." A cheer went up from the gathered neighbors. Emma felt tears in her eyes as she watched Sarah hug Mrs. Peterson, both women crying with joy at the prospect of former neighbors returning home. Detective Martinez pulled Emma aside during the impromptu celebration. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "We found evidence that Bradley was planning something big for the night after the court hearing, if you hadn't won that injunction." She handed Emma a set of plans that made her blood run cold. They detailed an accident involving her home's gas line timed to occur while she was sleeping. "He was really going to—" Emma's voice trailed off. Martinez nodded grimly. "Like I said at the beginning, these people play for keeps. But thanks to you, he'll be playing behind bars instead." As evening approached, Emma's neighbors organized an impromptu street party. Tables appeared in driveways. Children played freely where construction barriers had recently stood, and the atmosphere was one of relief and celebration. Mr. Chen had set up a projector, playing news coverage of Bradley and his father being led into federal court in handcuffs. The elder Thompson's face was a mask of rage, while Bradley just looked defeated. "You know what this means," Jessica said, joining Emma as she watched the footage. "Your stand didn't just save our neighborhood. You've exposed a nationwide network of corruption. Communities everywhere will be safer because you refused to back down." Emma looked around at her neighbors, not just neighbors anymore, but fellow warriors in a battle they'd fought and won together. The garden trellis would be repaired, the surveillance equipment was gone, and Bradley's threats were now nothing. more than evidence in a federal investigation, but something permanent had changed. They had learned the power of standing together, of refusing to be intimidated by wealth and corruption. The bonds forged in their struggle would last far longer than any construction barriers. "So," Jessica asked with a smile, "what's next for the neighborhood?" Emma watched as Sarah and Mrs. Peterson discussed plans for helping other communities fight similar battles, while Mr. Chen showed his surveillance footage to fascinated children, teaching them about standing up to bullies no matter how big they seemed. "We protect what we've built," Emma replied. "Not just our homes, but our community. Bradley thought he could break us by forcing us apart. Instead, he made us stronger by bringing us together." 6 months after Bradley Thompson's dramatic downfall, Emma's neighborhood had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The battle against Thompson Construction had sparked more than just legal victories. It had created a blueprint for communities fighting corporate corruption across the country. Emma stood in her newly expanded design studio, now twice its original size, thanks to the settlement money from the federal case against Thompson Construction. Through the window, she could see the community garden that had replaced the spot where construction barriers once stood, a symbol of growth emerging from conflict. "Another interview request," Jessica announced, walking in with her tablet, this time from a documentary crew. "They're doing a series on community activism and corporate accountability." Emma smiled, remembering how far they'd come. "Hard to believe it's only been 6 months since we were huddled in my kitchen, planning our defense against Bradley's threats." The changes in their neighborhood were both subtle and profound. Where privacy fences once divided properties, there were now shared spaces and walking paths. The former Thompson Construction surveillance points had been cleverly repurposed into community message boards and children's art displays. "Have you seen today's news?" Mr. Chen called out, approaching with his ever-present tablet. 2 more. Communities successfully blocked hostile takeover attempts using our playbook. The Richardson strategy, they're calling it. Emma laughed at the name, but it was true. Their experience had become a model for other neighborhoods facing similar threats. The documentation methods, legal strategies, and community organization techniques they'd developed were being studied and replicated nationwide. Sarah Kelly, who had been instrumental in exposing Thompson's past crimes, now ran workshops teaching other communities how to protect themselves from predatory development schemes. She was currently leading a session in Emma's converted garage, her voice carrying clearly through the open windows. "Remember," Sarah was saying to her attentive audience, "they count on isolation. The moment you start working together, sharing information, supporting each other, that's when their power starts to crumble." The workshop participants included residents from 3 different states, all facing their own battles against corporate overreach. Emma felt a surge of pride seeing how their local victory had sparked a larger movement. Detective Martinez, who had recently been promoted thanks to her role in the Thompson case, stopped by regularly to update them on the ongoing investigations. Today, she brought particularly satisfying news. Richard Thompson took a plea deal, she announced during their weekly community meeting. "He's giving up everything. Names, dates, bank accounts. The corruption network is falling apart." The ripple effects of their victory continued to spread. Bradley Thompson's arrest had triggered investigations into similar operations across the country. Law firms specializing in predatory development practices were facing increased scrutiny. City councils were implementing new transparency requirements for property developments. But the most significant changes were closer to home. The neighborhood had used their settlement money to establish a community trust, ensuring that future Development would serve local interests rather than corporate profits. Emma's design skills had found a new purpose as she helped create spaces that brought people together rather than keeping them apart. Mrs. Peterson, whose late husband's documents had proved so crucial in their fight, now chaired the community oversight committee. Under her watchful eye, every proposed change to the neighborhood underwent rigorous public review. "You know what Bradley never understood?" Mrs. Peterson mused during one of their regular garden gatherings. "He thought property was just about ownership, papers and permits and profits. He never saw that it's really about people and their connections to each other." The former Thompson construction headquarters, seized by federal authorities, had been converted into a community center. Emma had led the redesign herself, transforming the once imposing building into a welcoming space for neighborhood events, legal clinics, and workshops for other communities fighting similar battles. Laura Chen's investigative reporting on the Thompson case had earned her a National Journalism Award. More importantly, it had inspired a new wave of local reporting focused on exposing corporate corruption in property development. "People are finally paying attention," Laura said during her regular visit to document the neighborhood's transformation. "They're realizing that what happened here isn't unique. It's just that most communities never had the chance to fight back successfully." Even Mike, the truck driver who had first blocked Emma's driveway, had found redemption. After testifying against the Thompsons, he'd started a transport company dedicated to helping displaced residents move back into their former homes. The sight of his trucks now brought smiles rather than dread. Emma's design business had evolved, too. She now specialized in creating spaces that fostered community connection, incorporating lessons learned from their struggle. Her client list included other neighborhoods working to rebuild after surviving their own battles against corporate takeovers. The water rights that Bradley had coveted so desperately were now protected by a community trust, ensuring they would benefit the entire neighborhood rather than enriching a few developers. The trust's charter, drafted with input from every resident, became a model for other communities protecting their resources. One sunny afternoon, as Emma worked on designs for another community center, she received an unexpected visit from Judge Matthews. "I've been following what you've done with the place," the judge said, surveying the transformed neighborhood. "You've created something remarkable here. Not just a victory against corruption, but a genuine model for community empowerment." The judge wasn't alone in recognizing their achievement. Urban planning students now visited regularly, studying how the neighborhood had balanced development with community preservation. Legal scholars cited their case when discussing community rights versus corporate interests. But for Emma, the most meaningful validation came from the everyday moments. Children playing freely where construction barriers once stood. Neighbors stopping to chat in the community garden. Former Thompson victims returning to reclaim their homes. The security cameras that had once threatened their privacy were replaced by a network of neighbors looking out for each other. The legal documents that had been weapons in Bradley's hands were now tools for protecting community rights. "You know what's funny?" Jessica remarked during their weekly sister lunch. "Bradley thought he could break you by isolating you behind those barriers. Instead, he forced us all to realize how much stronger we are together." As Emma surveyed her neighborhood from her studio window, she reflected on how their battle against corporate bullying had evolved into something much more significant, a blueprint for community resilience and collective action. The construction barriers that once imprisoned her had become the foundation for building something Bradley Thompson could never understand. A community bound together not by force or fear, but by shared purpose and mutual support. "Ready for the community meeting?" Mr. Chen called out, interrupting her thoughts. Another neighborhood was seeking their advice on fighting a similar development scheme. Emma grabbed her tablet, filled with the documentation and strategies they'd developed. "Ready," she replied. Their story wasn't just about defeating corruption. It was about showing others they could do the same. As she walked to the community center that had once been Thompson's headquarters, Emma smiled at the irony. Bradley's attempts to divide and conquer had instead created an unshakable unity. His legacy wasn't the massive development he'd planned, but the movement for community empowerment he'd inadvertently inspired. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey of community triumph over corporate corruption. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to catch more amazing stories of justice and perseverance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.